Welcome to another Grasshopper tutorial. With this tutorial, what I'd like to do is explain how to build a facade with these shading panels, and I'll show you the example that I was looking at. But what I liked about them was that they, for one, started flat or in a kind of closed position on one side, and then along a length they rotated open to a completely open position. The other thing that was nice is that they staggered. So between the first level and the third level were the same, but the second level was a kind of halfway between them. So we can see that kind of staggering there. And the way that I chose to build it, we've got a number of options. And as I rotate this, we can kind of see the way that some of this will change. And so we can control the panel depth. So those are thicker panels. We can control the overall length of the facade, but that might be something that you'd prefer to control with geometry, and that's okay. We can choose the number of divisions. So you can see there's more panels added or less panels. And the panel width. So we can see the panel getting to be a much wider panel. And we can control the depth, which are kind of the floor slabs, maybe, as a way to think about this. The thickness of those floor slabs, as well as the height of the panels. And we can see that all of these are linked up. So I thought it was a nice precedent to look at, and a way to build this. And the precedent is actually, let's see if I can find it, is this example here. Which is an extension to the Athens airport. This is just taking a second to open. Okay, or not. So here's the example, and we can see the kind of flat panels along this edge and the way that they swing open. We can see the floor slab, or a kind of an edge running horizontally through, and we can see the way that the panels are staggered from the first floor to the second floor. So it just made me want to maybe break this down and explain how to go about building something like this. And so one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to connect a curve from kind of this direction to this direction, and that will allow us to have this kind of subtle opening along its length. And I'll also show you a trick for how to get these staggered in the way that I would go about building something like this. So with that, let's take a look at what we have here. For the most part, there is no Rhino geometry. And what I may do is just delete all of this, and then we can build from scratch. And I did that just so that I can keep the binoculars there. And we'll start. And so this should be the origin. And we can work at the origin, and we can start there. So let's start with constructing a point. And I'm okay to do this at 0, 0, which is the default. And let's make a simple line, and the line that we'll make will be start, direction, and length. And our starting point will be the origin, and the direction is going to be in the Y. So if we just search and use a unit Y as the direction, and the length will be our first parameter, and this is going to be essentially the depth of the facade. And what I might do for this is to say it is anything from 2, let's do this with 2 is less than 10.00. And this will give us a slider between 2 and 10 with 2 decimal places. And why don't we name this while we're here, and we'll call it facade depth. And this will be our length. And I think the problem here is it's just over, let's see. I think this should be just on top of this line on my axis. So we'll take a look at that, or we can shift it in a second and make sure that's the case. The next thing that I want to do is to move this line. So I'm going to keep this line, but I'm also going to move it, and that'll become the edge at the other end of the facade. And so that will be, we'll make a new slider, and this is going to be facade length. And let's do it from, I don't know, 100 is less than 200. And I think basically I'm working in feet. And we can do a move, and we'll move that line in the X direction. So we'll do unit X, and we'll do the unit X using that slider. And slide that over, and then let's name this facade length, because we're going to have a number of sliders. And this will allow us to keep track of them. I like, again, if you've worked on any of my previous tutorials, I like to pull the sliders all the way to the left so that I have all of the control kind of clear over on the side. And we have both of those. And actually you can see that size there. So facade depth is, looks to be about something like that. 10, and we can increase that if we want to. And now that we have those two lines, let's make, let's see, let's extrude it. And for this, we'll just use a simple extrusion or extrude. And let's extrude our first line in the X direction using that same vector. And so now we get a surface there. And we'll use this surface as a reference. It's essentially on the ground plane or on the 0, 0. And we've got our two lines at the end. And we have that extrude. So what I'd like to do, and if you remember a little bit, because the panels will go flat along one edge and then turn, what I wanted to be able to do was to manipulate a point to connect a line. And so what I mean with that, if you see my mouse, is that I want to have the control to be able to move a point along here and move a point along here. And what I'll do is connect those 2 points with a line. Because what I wanted to really be able to do is when the panels are flat, to either bring them to the front edge or the back edge. And then when the panel is open, that depending on what edge defines that, we can move that one way or another. And so now we have these two lines. We have a line at either end. I'm going to turn off the preview of the construct point. So I have that. And what I'll do now is use point on curve. And I can copy this because we're going to do it for each line. And this will allow us to either move it to the front or the back, and move this one to the front or the back. I think really where I want to do this is have this along the front edge when the panels are flat, and then move to the back when the panel is open. And so once I have that, let's create a line between them. And this will be between 2 points. And our start point is on the left, and our end point is on the right. And so now we can see the way that that line will also shift along its length. And so now that we have those, let's continue to work with this. And what I'd like to do, the next major thing is to basically connect. What I want to do is have one line along here and another line along here, and through controlling these two lines, I want to create a connected curve between them. And so it's going to take a couple of steps, but as we work through this, you'll get a sense for how this will work. And so first thing that we'll do is we'll create a line, and then we'll do the same type of line with the start, direction, and length. And we'll start it using our point there. We want this to move in the direction of the line that we created here. And let's give it a length. And I think between 0 is less than, let's say, 25.00. Because it will take a little bit of adjustment once we make this connected curve. So we can just see a little line here in the way that that's working. And so that'll be one of our lines. The other line that we're going to create is similar, so we can copy these two. And its starting point will be the other point. But its direction is going to be in the Y. So we can do unit Y. And we can see that it's moving here. And so let's see what happens if we make this negative. So that did move in the other direction. And now the only thing that we want to do is that to connect these two, I actually want to pull or move this line more in the Y direction. So let's move it. So the geometry is that line. We'll move it in the Y direction. And let's increase that factor. Let's do 0 is less than 100. And we'll plug that in. And that's still 0, so and so we can see it's moving. If I use a positive number, it's moving in this direction, but I'm imagining that this is the front of the facade, so I actually want to pull this line out to the front. So I'm going to change, if I double click my slider, I'm going to, instead of going from 0 to 100, I'm going to go from minus 100 to 0. And now as I increase that, we can see what happens. So this line is pulling out. And again, this is in service of creating a connected curve between these two lines. So let's look at how we do that. We can see one curve is here, our other curve is here. So we can even pull these so that they're aligned with one another. And so the next thing that we should do is let's look at a blend curve. So with this blend curve, let's connect the first curve and the second curve. We can see the way that this moves through between them. And the continuity, we can see, let's set this as, it's set to be curvature, and that's okay. And these are both set to 1, and that's okay. And so what this allows us to do now is to manipulate. We can see as we move one curve, what happens. We can see as we change its length, not too much is happening. And let's see, as we change this length, I want to increase. All right, we can see as our second line, as we make that 0, this just moves to that point. And so the first line that we had, we can see when that's 0, it's just a straight connection between the two. As we give that a little bit of length, that starts to curve a little bit. And so this can be anything more than 0. This can be a small number. This is this length along here. And then as it comes to 0, which is all the way out here. And that's really what we want, is a kind of gentle curve that moves between those, that puts a point out here. So now we can see this curve is going all the way, well, it connects to that end point there. And that's actually okay for us. And I'll explain why in a second, but because we want to kind of offset the points and the connection between them, we can see there's a little gap. That little gap is the length of our line, but you can leave it like that, it's okay. So now we're going to move to the next step. And the next step is to divide these two curves so that we can have a set of lines between them. And so let's move to a divide curve, and we'll do 2 of these. And remember, the default count is 10. So as we divide that, and then we also want to have another divide curve all the way back to our straight line that's back here. And so we can copy this and pull this over. Let's set another parameter, which will just be, let's do 10 is less than 100. And let's name it Facade Division. And we'll plug this into the count. Because it starts at 10, nothing's going to change. But as we increase this, we can see the number of points increasing. And my rationale here is that I want to have enough points that are half increments. And the reason why I say half increments is that what I want to do is select the evens or select the odd, and then that will give me the stagger between the two facades on the first level versus the second level. And we'll take a look at that now. And what we'll be able to do is we'll cull that pattern between these two for the even or odds, and we'll be able to adjust the number of divisions based on that. So start with something maybe in the 30 to 40 range, and then we can look at culling these two patterns, or culling this list of points. So we'll go up to sequence, and we'll cull pattern. And we're going to need 4 of these. So we can copy these while we're here. And the reason for that is that we have, this is the curve, this is the straight line. So what we'll do is we'll connect the points from the curve, and the curve. Oh, sorry, I did that wrong. So I'll connect the 2 lists of points to the 2 cull patterns, and I'll do the same there. Maybe we can get a little bit more room between these. And what we want to do is to create a pattern. And the way that I like to do the patterns is just with a simple panel. And let's set our first panel. So we can do // and enter. If we right click this, we want to do multi-line data. And the reason for that is once we click it, we want one of these to be 0, then enter, and 1, which means that this will be basically the 2nd, 4th, 6th, so basically the even numbers. And if we copy this panel, we can then flip those around, and it'll be 1, enter, 0. And it's basically 1 is true, 0 is false. And let's see what happens as we plug these into these cull patterns. So we'll plug this one into the top and this one into the bottom, and we'll take a look at it. We might need to reverse some of the curves, but let's take a look. And so this appears, let's see, let's hide our full sets of points, and we can see what we get here and here. And here and here. And a quick test, maybe if you're ever working with this and you want to see how to let's see, under display and vectors, we can do a point list. And what's nice about this is that we can number the points. And I'll use a panel, maybe set their size to 3. So now we can see along that length, that goes from 0, 1, 2, 3, all the way to 17. If I plug in this one, that one's also 0 to 17. Let's check these. 0 to 17. And 0 to 17. And remember, my total points is 35, but these, by culling the patterns, I'm selecting kind of either even or odd. So that looks like that's going to work fine. The next thing I want to do is to connect lines between these two. So let's create a line with a start and an end. We'll see what this looks like. That worked nicely. We can copy this, and we'll do the same here. The start and the end. And that also looks good. If for any reason you're getting these lines that are crossing, you'll just need to flip the curve. And there's a simple command, which is just simply flip curve. And you can insert that flipped curve, which will then change the order. So if when you looked at those numbers and it went from when mine went from 1 to 17, if yours went from 17 to 1, left to right, you can insert this flip curve, and that'll just change the direction of your curve. But for now, both of these are looking good for what I want to do. And these lines that I just drew between the curve and the straight line, these will be the vector for the way that the panel's open. And so we can start using these. That what we'll do is we'll now make the first row of the panels themselves, and we'll do this with another line, but it'll be the line that's the start direction and length. And so the start will be your culled points, your direction will be the line, and now let's make a panel that is, let's say 0.5 is less than 10. And let's call this panel width. We'll plug this in. And I think 0.5 is a little small. And we can see here the panels are coming off in the opposite direction. And so what I might do, let's see, maybe we'll use that, see if that flip curve works for this line and for that direction. And it did. So if I zoom in, we can see these green lines here. We can also use a negative panel length, but in this case, I'll keep it like that. And so there's one row of panels, and let's do the same for the other row. So let's click on our culled list. We want to use our start points as those that are on the straight line. So those will be the starts. The direction will be the lines that we drew. Again, these are off the back, and so I'm going to add the flip curve here to basically flip the trajectory for the direction. And so now we have those, and I'm going to use actually the same panel width for the length. And this will actually be a parameter that I want to pull all the way back to where we started. While it does cross some of the strings, it gets us our parameters all the way over here at the beginning. And so now it's always useful to kind of manipulate these as we're working. So here's our panel depth. Here's the width of our overall facade. We can see that those are updating and changing. And then we can just probably make out, I think it's buried a little bit underneath, but our panel width. And so as we add height to those, we'll be able to see them more clearly here. And I think that makes sense for us to add that height. So what I'd like to do is extrude both of them, and it's going to be the half increments along there, with an idea that we'll move one row up to occupy the second level. But let's start with an extrusion. That'll be, the base will be our line. The direction will be Z. And let's create another panel, and let's say this is 8 is less than 20. And let's label this panel height. So we can see those are 8 foot. I can make them a little taller. So now they're a little more visible. because it's not just lines that are set there. Let's copy this, and we'll extrude the other lines. So now we can see all of them are overlapping, but remember, we're going to take one row and we're going to move it up to the second level. Before I do that, I want to give them some thickness. And so we can extrude an extrusion, which will turn it to have a thickness. And the way that I'm going to do this is, because they're all changing, I want to get the normal of each of those surfaces. And the way that I'll do that is to start with the, let's start with the area. And while we don't need the area of that panel, this will give us the centroid. And what's nice with the centroid is that then we can evaluate the surface. And we want to evaluate it at the point of the centroid, and we want to use the surface to evaluate the extrusion, and that's going to give us a series of planes. And at first I was worried that these weren't lining up with the actual panels. It doesn't actually matter, but it is giving us a kind of normal or plane that's a definition of the normal of those panels. So what we can do now is to create a line, which will be a direction of an extrusion that we want for the depth of the panel. So let's create another line, which will be the start direction and length. The direction is going to be the normal. The start is going to be the centroid. And let's create a slider, which will be, let's say, 0.5 is less than 3. And let's call this panel thickness. We'll plug that into the length. And so what we should get we can see just that little line. I'll increase this. And so that's going to be a normal that we'll extrude our panel with. And so let's use that. We'll do another extrusion. And our base will be our first extrusion. And our direction will be our line. And we can see now we have thickness. We can do that. And let's see. That looks good. I was working through this earlier. We could make this, let's see. We could flip the direction. Let's see, flip curve. And so if you're really kind of focused on not wanting that last panel to come off the edge of this piece, I just flipped the direction with a flip curve, and now it ends up extruding the panel thickness in the other direction. And so that looks good. We can copy all of this down to the next level here. And again, we'll use the extrusion down here as the surface. We'll use that extrusion to get the centroid. And we wanted to use the extrusion that made the surface to extrude to make that panel. So all of that looks good now too. And remember, there's way too many panels here, but we're going to move some of them up. Before we do that, why don't we clean up our representation by just trying to hide a number of these things that we see here. And I also do want to come back and use the same panel thickness for the length. So we have just one parameter. And again, that'll be a parameter that I pull all the way back. Let's hide our evaluate surface. We have those. We can even hide our first extrusions. We can hide a lot of these lines here. Let's pull our panel height down for these two parameters. We can select all of these and hide them. So we're really paring this down. We don't even need to see this curve or these points anymore. So I can also hide that. I can pull down surface division. There's probably just a few. I'm not going to worry about pulling the parameters or the sliders that control that overall curve because the curve is working fine. I do want to pull these few sliders together, pull them over to the end. So let's take a look and see how this is working. So we have our facade depth. That's really the ledge or the slab at the bottom. The overall length of our facade is here. Our panel width. The number of divisions on the facade. The height of the panel. And the thickness of the panel. That's not actually changing for me, so let's take a look at the panel thickness. And why that's not changing. It may have to do with the flipping the curve, but let's take a look and see. So here we can see these lines. That's okay. And that's the extrusion. So maybe I was wrong. Let's look at maybe making this a negative number. We'll see if that works. So I had it from 0.5 to 3. Double click it and we'll go from minus 0.5 to minus 3. And again, the reason for this is just over here on the edge. Let's plug that direction back in. And so that's controlling some of these. So it seems like once we use that flip curve, it doesn't give us that level of control. So let's remove that flip curve here and plug that in. All right, so now we're able to control the thickness of the panel. That looks good. Let's hide this line. And let's pull this parameter all the way back. All right, we're almost there. What do I have there? I've got a couple of other things that are still visible. We have those points and that. Okay, so remember we have all of the panels here. Let's do just a couple more things. And what I'd like to do is we'll end up moving the panels up. And as we do that, let's check. I just want to make another extrusion. So here's our panel on the bottom. Let's extrude our extrusion. And so our base will be that. And here I want to extrude this in the Z direction. And that probably just went up. So now we get an intersection or a clash between these. So let's make, let's make a slider that also, we could use the panel thickness, which is both a negative number, and then this will also, the thickness of the panel will match the thickness of that piece. That could be a nice thing. If you want those two things to be different, you could give it a different parameter, but I would use a negative number to do that. So let's hide our first extrusion. Now we have that. And now let's look at moving that piece up. Actually, here's that first panel is overhanging ever so slightly. And what we can do is move our point. See, we can move these front to back along here. And so we can just set this point back enough so that the shading panel doesn't come up beyond there. What I want to do now is move, create a new, basically by moving, create a new copy of this floor plate up here at the top. And so let's look at moving that. That will also be in the Z direction. And it should be something related to the panel height. But we might need to give it a little bit more. So we'll see, here's panel height. And it looks like if we look from the side, it needs to be the panel height plus the thickness of the slab. And so we can do that by adding the two. So let's do an addition. And so we'll do panel height plus panel thickness. And we'll see if we need to, let's try making a negative out of the negative, and we'll see if that works. So because the panel thickness was a negative number that went down, we actually want this to be positive and get added together. We'll see if this works. And so that did work. And so what we did is we took the panel height and we took the panel thickness, but because the panel thickness was negative, we multiply that times -1, and both of these work to give us that new panel height there, or that locate that slab in the right location. Okay, so the next thing we should do is move one of our sets of panels up so that it occupies the next level. And so if we find that, which is all the way over here on the side, which is maybe this one, let's move this up. That's the geometry. The move is going to be Z. And I think it might actually be the same thing that we just did, the addition of the panel height and that thickness. So let's take this added result try and plug it in over here into the Z. We want to hide that extrusion. And that worked nicely. So let's just do a couple more of these. So what we want is we want another horizontal panel or horizontal slab. That's this piece. Let's copy it. We'll plug the top one into there. And that worked. And now let's take, so here are those three. And then let's take our panels that are at the lower level and we'll move these up. And so we can move them with a Z. And let's just add, what if we, I think we may be able to do a multiplication. I'll just use a panel, so / / 2. I'm going to multiply the added two elements. Take this result and let's see what happens if we multiply it times 2. So that worked nicely. And let's just put one more cap here. We'll do the same thing, we'll just copy that and use that geometry. Right, and the reason why I'm doing it is just for each of these, it's just one more increment, and if we add that increment to a copy of the previous one, where each of these exist, we just keep adding them up. So that looks pretty good. As we zoom around, we can see that our panels are moving from a kind of flat condition and then slowly rotating as they get to the other edge. So let's go all the way back to our parameters. Remember, we can control our depth. We can control our overall length of our facade. And we can, if you want it to be longer, you can increase that the values in the slider. Our panel width. Division, if we want more panels. The height of our panels. And we can see that all of our elements are interacting nicely. And then our panel thickness, which is also our slabs. So all of that is working nicely. The last thing that we could do if we want is to just give this a slightly better representation. And for that, we should do a custom preview, which will pull in a bunch of different geometry. While we're here, let's set the swatch. So you can choose a color. And let's just begin plugging in these different elements. We're going to hold down Shift as we add these. And let's just remember to hide them as we're here. We can even pull this along the length as we go see. I guess all we need are our horizontals. here, so we'll hold down Shift. Just add each of these. Let's hide them. I'm using Control Q as a shortcut to hide them. And let's take our custom preview all the way down to the end, to the right. And so now we have a nice facade. These panels are overlapping slightly at the end, but I personally really like going from a really closed wall condition to then having these slowly rotate open to a fully open condition. So I hope this helps. Introduced a number of elements just about how we would construct this so that it opens along that length using the curve. We divided those two curves, and then we also split them using even and odd so that we could get this staggered pattern, so that all of these don't just line up vertically, they alternate, which I think is a really nice, clean effect for a nice shading system like that. So if you have questions, you can post them to the comments. I'm going to continue to update this content, so please subscribe to the YouTube channel. And if this was helpful, please give this a like. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to see what you end up making with this. Thanks.